When you're growing up, what was first to attract your attention? Was it art or was it music?
I guess it was more music, because when I was living at home, my mother was playing classical piano, and my father was playing piano, and she was singing great, really had a good voice, and she was singing, and we had lots of records like Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, all those things. That's the first thing. Then again, at the same time, we went to exhibitions and saw lots of stuff in Berlin. I was living in Berlin.
Now, I guess it would be impossible to talk to you and not have the subject of the Beatles come up in the conversation. Do you remember the first time you saw them?
Yeah, the first time was in Hamburg. I was sort of walking along the Reeperbahn, and I never was exposed to rock and roll music, to live rock and roll music. That was the first time I went down the cellar, and where I heard from the outside, I heard this rock and roll music, and I went inside and saw the band. It was the first rock and roll band I've ever seen live.
Was there star potential obvious to you right from the start? Could you see what was going to happen?
Well, I wasn't in a position to sort of judge if that's a star or no star or whatever. To me, it was just great rock and roll music, and those guys were so fresh and so happy and friendly, and the people had such a good time that I was just knocked out. And then when they started making records, when they started to get into it and trying to be successful, I sort of got a glimpse of what this rock and roll music and pop music is all about. Then I thought it took much too long. I should have been more famous much quicker, because they're so fantastic.
How competitive was it amongst the English bands that came over to Hamburg?
Well, it wasn't competitive. I wouldn't look at it this way. It was, most of the bands just played to make the people feel good and make them dance. Like it was a dance hall. People were going for having a good time, and they needed some background music. And with Beatles, it was just more, because they did not just play the songs like, oh yeah, we're going to do our next number. They really gave a great performance. They really made the people feel good. They talked to them, and they smiled, and they had a great aura around them, and that most of the other bands did not have. I don't want to say that none of them had it, but to that extent, the Beatles were the only one, and they had the biggest repertoire, and they were just a fantastic band.
How important do you think those times in Hamburg were for the Beatles? I mean, for example, had they not gone there, what do you think their career may have taken a different path?
I think that the fact, in the first place, that those four people were together eventually. In Hamburg, there wasn't Ringo in the band. There was just Pete Best was playing drums, and Stuart Sutcliffe was playing the bass. But that those, in the first place, those three people found together and made music is a unique thing. And I think if they would have stayed in Liverpool and did their thing, the same thing would have happened. But the fact that they played night after night for 8 hours or more gave them the chops to be able to go out there and write those songs. They knew all those songs they played, which were all sort of how do you say? They cover versions of all American songs by Little Richard or Chuck Berry or what. And later on they started writing music, but at that point you didn't even know their potential of songwriting. All you could see was their great charisma and their will to be really good and professional.
Now, I believed you lived with George and Ringo for a while. I guess you would have had a first-hand view of how stardom and notoriety had been affecting them. What was that like?
Well, it was very, very strange for me, because I knew them before they were famous, and we kept contact. They wrote us letters, and Astrid was close to them, and I was, and Jürgen, and we wrote letters to each other, and they told us what was happening to them. So we kept in contact. But the fact that they suddenly were so famous and you were going to meet those old friends was very difficult, because you cannot stop a wall being built up between you. It's impossible because they're so famous and you're so little in comparison to them that there must have been, always was very difficult in the first moment you meet them. That was hard. But from then on, it was just friends, like old friends. It was fantastic.
Now, what about yourself? What first attracted you to the bass guitar?
I don't know. People ask me that all the time. I have no idea. It's just something about a band on stage and the sort of backbone to music was, to me, what the bass drum was doing and the bass was doing. And I enjoyed that so much. And the first band I ever played on was Paddy, Klaus and Gibson, with Gibson Kemp, who was playing in those days in Hamburg with the King Size Taylor and the Dominoes. It was very much this basic thing of working together with a bass drum and the bass, and that gave, with our little band, it was just a trio, gave really strong feeling. And I always liked bass. I don't know why.
Now, before long, you found yourself with your own success, being a part of Manfred Mann at a very successful time in that band's career. How did you cope with suddenly being thrusted into stardom yourself?
I don't know, it just happened. I mean, stardom with Manfred Mann was no comparison to the Beatles.
Of course.
But it was a part of it. It was part of it, and we had lots of hits, and we were on television. It was just working in that sort of, in that media of pop music and variety and whatever you call it. And it was, to me, it wasn't nothing special, really. I always thought back of the bands playing on stage, and suddenly I was up there playing too. It was somehow very natural to me.
Of course, something you're also very well known for is your cover design on the Revolver album, the Beatles. Were you given any specific instruction as to what the boys wanted on that album cover?
No, they gave me complete freedom. They just said, come up with some ideas, and if we like the idea, you have the job. You can do the cover. And they did not say, we want our heads on it, we want lots of hair, we want it black and white. Those are all my ideas and my suggestions to them. And as it happened, they liked my ideas and my suggestions, and they gave me the job, and I finished the cover.
Now, when you're at your busiest times with your music, did you always keep that interest in your artwork still going?
That interest in artwork?
Yeah.
Well, it was, how can you say, it was difficult because when you're on the road or if you're in the studios and you're very involved in playing the bass and other instruments in the studio, and then suddenly a job comes to do something in graphics. That was very difficult. Every time I had to jump back out of nothing back into doing graphics. It was very much in the back of my head, and only if somebody asked me, I was getting my equipment out and started doing art again. Well, it was very difficult.
Tell us about the Plastic Ono band and that very first gig in Toronto. The legends have it that it was very hurriedly put together and there wasn't much time for rehearsal. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was really a misunderstanding. That's how it all happened. It's the truth that John was asked by a friend to come to Toronto and do this concert, and go to this concert. He said, you want to come to Toronto, and there's going to be Little Richard and all these people playing, all those rock and rollers, Chuck Berry, and he said, yeah, sure, I come. But he didn't know that they wanted him to play. He just thought he goes there to watch all the bands and have a good time. And then a few months later, they asked, well, John, it's getting closer, who's in your band? What band? And then he suddenly was confronted with this thing, and I guess it was Yoko who came up and said, come on, John, let's just go, and we do give peace a chance, and that will be a good start for you. Let's do this. And that's how it all came together. Then he called Eric, And then he called me, and then we didn't have a drummer, and he said, who are we going to take? So somebody said, oh yes, this Alan White is really good, but nobody knew Alan White. So it was a real jump in the cold water. We had no rehearsals, and just went on the plane and tried to rehearse on the plane, which is very hard with electrical instruments, which have no... Like, for example, my bass, you can't hear an electric bass in the back of a jet plane with the jets next to you. It was impossible to really rehearse properly. So, I mean, if you listen to the concert, it's really rough and it's really bad if you ask me. But in another way, it was a great occasion and we had a good time.
Now, you played on the Great All Things Must Pass album for George, and that must have been some wonderful sessions. What do you recall of those?
Well, of all the sessions I've done, those sessions were the most tranquil and nice and lovely feeling from start to end. It was only positive. It took long. The recording sessions were long, and George took a lot of care to do it properly. But he never gave us a hard time, and he never had anybody in the studio that was close to giving us a hard time. It was only really, really nice from start to end.
How did John and George compare for you in the studio working on their solo albums? Did they both approach their own recordings differently?
Very different, yes. John, you see, this is one of the reasons I think that those Beatle boys work together so well. The one is very musical, like Paul and George, and John was musical too, but it's a completely different approach. And because each one had this different approach, that made this an interesting gel of those three people creating music. If it was the backing or some guitar solo, if it was the structure of a song, and then Ringo, with his dimension, just added something else. And with John, it was a little difficult because he wanted to get out of the studio as quick as possible. And sometimes he used the musicians, even before I was a friend, he still used the musicians to just put down on tape what he had in his mind, and he was getting very frustrated if it didn't go quick enough. And George is completely opposite. He spent a long time just preparing for it and lighting the candle or making it really cozy and telling a little story, but still working. It doesn't mean we just have a party. He just took the whole thing more down to a certain calm level, and then he started recording. He did not just jump into it. Come on, let's get the instrument, play the song. And that was more John's sort of attitude.
I guess having known the guys so well already yourself, that probably would have made it a little bit easier for you adapting to their different styles and their different ways of recording.
That's true. I mean, for example, John had a song. He didn't quite know how to do the song. It was the number 9 Dream on Walls and Bridges, and he sort of asked me, well, what do you think? You think I shouldn't put that song on there? I said, why? It's a great song. No, but you know, this middle eight is so boring. And then I suggested, why don't you do it nice and calm and do complete time change and do it all different? So we sort of worked together, which was nice, instead of just him doing all the work. That happened sometimes, not all the time. Most of the times he had the song and he knew exactly what he wanted, but sometimes he wasn't quite sure.
That very first Plastic Ono Band album for John was a very intense and personal piece of work. Did the mood and the feel in the studio reflect that?
Yes, definitely. And to me, it's my favorite LP because it was so direct. It was the songs were fresh. The feeling that made him write those songs was fresh, and the recording was the first or second take. We didn't take long to do it, and it was really very straightforward, quick writing, putting down what he wanted to do, and that's really good for most of John's songs. Sometimes you would have expected him to take a little longer and do a nicer arrangement or something. But with some songs, it was really this. And this first LP, I think it's unique, and that way it really worked. I think the LP is fantastic. If you think of Imagine or other ones, I would have thought, well, you could have done better production on this and that.
Now, you moved to America yourself in the 70s. What was the catalyst for that move?
Well, everybody went to America. I was back and forth from London to New York, from back to London, from London to LA, back to London, from London to New York, from London to Nashville or whatever. I was all the time on the plane. One thing on the Imagine LP, they were in the studio and they suddenly realized that the mix they had done on one of the songs of Imagine, the bass was too quiet. So they just flew me in for one song to just put the same bass part on again, just because it was too quiet on the mix. And that I finally was fed up, and I thought, well, just as well go and live in Los Angeles if I'm going back and forth. Because Ringo was recording in LA, George was recording in LA, John was recording in New York, Carly Simon was there, and Harry was doing lots of records. All the people I worked with and I became close to worked in Los Angeles or New York. So I thought I'd just as well move over there.
You worked on a wonderful range of albums during that time. Were you very selective in deciding who to record with?
Well, it's funny because it was only a small crowd of people, really, just a great crowd of people. But I was never really in a situation where I had to say, select in that sort of way. I wasn't asked to play on that many records. I was not the typical session musician who was going from doing a commercial in the morning and then playing for Bob Dylan and at the night to play for Sly Stone or something. I wasn't one of those. I was more, and I'm very happy about this, I was much more a sort of friend that was asked to be part of a creation instead of just playing a bass part on a record. I was part of being a creation, and I was happy about that, and it was great.
Outside your sessions with the various members of the Beatles, what would be your personal favourite session?
Outside of the Beatles?
Yeah, outside of the Beatles.
Well, I must say the fact that Randy Newman asked me to play on his record was a great thing for me, because I always liked Randy, and I wish I would have had the chance to play more for Randy Newman, because he and I would have gotten on well too as people, I think. But it wasn't. I only played on a few sessions together with Jim Keltner, and it was wonderful. Short People is, one of the songs I played on.
Of course, yeah. Now, you had a brief foray into production work in the 80s. How do you look back on that time now?
Which ones are you talking about?
You did a bit of work in production, an ethical trio, I think, is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I came over to Germany after I played all those years in America, and I somehow didn't quite know what I was going to do, because I played with all these fantastic people and had those great people in the studio, and I thought, well, to play bass, I don't want to play bass again. So somehow it happened that I worked for a record company, and I got to know the artists that were kind of roaming around, and one of them was Trio. And it was a good time in Germany, because you had those new German bands, which I don't know which ones you know in Australia, most likely not many. For example, there's a boy called Joachim Witt who did the Goldene Reiter, or there was Ideal. Some great German bands with some really great music that was just created. And I was happy about this, because the Germans, for one, had now the chance to portray their feelings in a type of music they created themselves. It was an own creation. It was not just copying off Bruce Springsteen or Bob Dylan or what, and doing the same thing with just speaking German, because the German language is very hard and very hard to sing. And that was the first time that they did, how can you say, their own handicap, that the language was so hard, they used as a mean to create some music. The music was rigid, the singing was rigid, and it was a personal style, and I liked that very much. And that was the reason I thought, well, let's get into it. The fact that I started producing was Trio's fault, I would say. They asked me if I would do that, and I thought, well, let's give it a go. So I produced Trio through 3 LPs.
Did you enjoy the experience of producing?
With Trio, I did enjoy it, but I did not really feel that I am the right person to do productions. I don't like telling people what to do. If it's the chemistry in a band to work with people, to make them work together, that I'm very good at. But I'm not a person, I don't know left from right, I don't know which bar you have to do the vocal on, or where the drum is not. I can't keep track of things. I hear it when I hear it, but I can't, like some people, they have a head where you have all the details of the song from start to end, and I don't have that. I have it when I look at something, or if I hear it at the moment, but I can't have the whole song in front of me, or a whole LP and a whole production. That's difficult for me, and that's why I think there's lots of other people which are much, much better in doing production.
Just talking about what you're up to these days, Klaus, are you doing much in the way of music, or is it mostly your art that's taking up your time?
I don't do any music.
At all?
No, the bass is just standing there somewhere in the basement, and I'm not doing any music.
Right, so
just doing art, doing some illustrations, and looking after the kids, and feeling okay.
Tell us a little bit about the artwork that you're doing now.
Oh, I did some record covers for a band. The last thing I've done was for a band called Turbo Negro. I don't know if you know those people in Australia. It's a sort of death punk, heavy metal, I don't know what to call it. And it was great. They asked me to do a record cover, and they wanted something to do with a skull or with a shepherd dog or something. So I made this funny thing that looks like a ring, and there's a head of a skull, and that skull turns into a snake, and then it eats itself. And I like that, so they used it as a cover. It looks good.
Now, I know you have got the guitar out for some special events. I know you did the tribute concert for George.
Yeah.
How was that night for you?
It was great. It was great to do something for George. The actual experience was, how can you say, it was just so sad, because the person who the concert was for wasn't really there. And if George would have been there, the occasion would have been that much better, of course, and that was always in the back of my mind, and the way people were acting was exactly how George would not have done it, and that made me very sad. Made me very, very, how can you say, sad, I think is the right word.
Yeah. Did you stay in touch with George right up to the end?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw him, last time I saw him, he was already very ill, and he had no hair on his head, and I was shaving his head because he couldn't get to the back of his head with his razor, so I shaved his head, and we talked, and he had great plans, and he wanted to do this and that, and he did not give in, let's say, and he thought, well, I could be off in a few months, but it can be that I'm going to make it. He still was in hope, and he did not. He did not say, "I'm going to die soon."
I just want to thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and must thank you personally for your contribution to some of the greatest music ever recorded.
Well, thank you very much for calling, and say hello to all your radio people.
Most certainly will.
Okay.
Thanks again, Klaus. All the best. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.